Well, friends, at the start, we are
200.
214 right now. Congratulations to all the participants, and more particularly, Abhay Bhai, maybe because of your efficiency to deliver, has attracted more numbers at the right at the initial stage. I, on behalf of AIFTP, welcome you all on today's webinar on GST on controversial issues. Part 1, Part 2 will be on 29th. This with the same speaker. I welcome you all. And in the meanwhile, I have to make some announcements with reference to upcoming webinar and others. Tomorrow is Mr. Mukesh Patel. He will be dealing with the new provisions of personal taxation as per the Finance Act 2020 and some issues on tax planning. I would wish you and your friends, you may make everybody join this webinar tomorrow once again at 11:30. We at AIFTP are determined to contribute to this COVID-19 pandemic. We have given a link on our website kindly, and even messages have been given to the members. Kindly please donate generously. The minimum prescribed is 1,000. You can go above that, no issue. And we have also released yesterday an e-publication on Vivad Se Vishwas scheme. Kindly please log in. It is free to log in and read that book. Thank you so much. I now hand over for introduction or a welcome address by National President, by introduction of the speaker by Mr. Bhaskar Patel.
Madam National President Nikita Ben, Secretary General Samir Bhai Jani,
He has an internet problem.
Office Bearer of the AIFTP, the participants, those who have joined this meeting. I am introducing Mr. C. Abhay Desai, today's speaker. I would like to say few words regarding him. He is all India rank holder at CA examination done LLB as well as ISA qualified. Started practice right after qualification with Yagnesh Desai and Company. Has recently authored the book on Sabka Vishwas Legacy Dispute Resolution Scheme 2019, published by the Chamber of Tax Consultants Mumbai. Has also authored the book Get Ready for GST. He has co-opted as member of Indirect Tax Committee of ICAI, member of the GST group formed by ICAI to make recommendation to the state and central government. Has addressed more than 400 seminars on indirect taxes till date. Has made representation before the Finance Minister of India as well as the Deputy Finance Minister of India on various issues under GST. Presented papers at Delhi, Bangalore, Ahmedabad, Vadodara, Surat, Mumbai, Nagpur, Vapi, Gandhidham, Bharuch, Anand, Nadiyad, Rajkot, Daman, etc. Has published more than 250 articles. Articles are regularly published in GST Law Times by Sentex, GST Journal by Taxman, Tax Guru, VST Journal, Sales Tax Journal by Bar Association. Board member of NGO based in Delhi, advisor to Fortune 500 companies, as well as large number of listed companies in the field of indirect taxation. Winner of All Gujarat Elocution competition held by Bar Association. Awarded as best column writer by the Gujarat Sales Tax Bar Association. A brain trustee in All Gujarat seminar by Bar Association. By these few words, I am introducing Mr. Abhay Desai, today's speaker on the subject of GST. Please welcome.
Yes, sir. So now, Abhayji, you can carry on, please.
Yeah. So thank you, AIFTP, Nikita ma'am, Bhaskar bhai, Samir bhai, all the other committee members of the association, seniors of the profession and friends who are listening to this webinar. It is indeed my pleasure and honor to be invited to deliberate on a topic. Okay, now is it better?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So now, friends, the input tax credit, I will, because the time is finite, I will try to and go to the crux of the issues and avoid discussing certain subsidiary issues, certain ancillary issues at length. But before we deal with the issues emanating out of Section 16, friends, it is very important to understand that the input tax credit, the entire purpose of ushering the GST is because in the earlier regime, lot of tax credits were not available to the businesses. Lot of taxes that the businesses were paying were getting blocked. They were getting restricted, which eventually resulted into those taxes becoming part of the cost. So we have whole host of examples that you can think of, be it the central sales tax, be it the tax which is paid by a trader, the tax on the services that he avails, be the tax paid by the service providers on the goods that he purchases. So there were so many blockages in the earlier regime, which resulted into cascading effect of taxes, which is as such against the policy or the framework which has been laid down by the OECD when it comes to taxing under the indirect tax regime, which requires the businessman to ensure that the entire tax that they have paid on all their procurements is transparently passed on to the eventual customer, so that the entire burden falls on the end consumer and nowhere in the entire chain of value addition the tax becomes the cost. This is also reflected in statement which was put before the parliament when the CGST bill was introduced, where if you refer to para 5 of the statement of objects and reasons of the CGST bill, it has been clearly identified and mentioned there that the whole purpose of GST is to enable the seamless flow of credit so that the tax do not become part of the cost. Now, friends, this principle is important because as we go ahead in today's session, as well as the next part 2 of this topic, the underlying framework, the underlying way of interpreting the provision by the courts, in my mind, would be to respect the intent, to respect the objective with which the input, the GST has been ushered in, and to favor an interpretation which furthers the object rather than favoring an interpretation which defeats the object. So that is fundamental to this topic. Credit has to be allowed wherever possible. The blockages, the restrictions has to be seen narrowly, has to be interpreted narrowly in a sense to ensure that the seamless flow of credit is not curtailed on an unreasonable base, on a base which is not sustainable. So with that, friends, let us understand the law. Section 16, subsection 1, which is the first provision that you will come across when you refer to the GST law as far as the topic is concerned. Now, each and every phrase, each and every word mentioned in this particular provision is important. It has various issues that we will discuss for each and every aspect. Now, see, first and foremost, friends, as you can see the provision, it says every registered person. So first and foremost, to avail the input tax credit, you must be a registered person. This is a stark contrast to what we had in the earlier regime, where the law allowed the SENVAT credit to a manufacturer, to a service provider. There was no requirement that that person should be a registered person. And therefore, we have decisions in the past where exporters who were, even if they were not registered, they were able to claim the refund of the SENVAT credit of the goods or services that they might have used in manufacturing the goods which have been exported. However, the GST law is different. The GST law says that only registered person would be allowed the credit. Hence, it is very important that if your client, if your assessee is liable for registration, kindly obtain the same within time, because once you cross the time limits, and if in future, if the department identifies that such person levies tax on the outward supplies that that person would have made, the person would not be, in my opinion, would be able to claim the credit for the reason that that person was not the registered person when he had received the goods or services for which now at a future date he intends to avail the credit. Then the law says that the registered person will be able to avail the credit, but that will be subject to conditions and restrictions. Now, friends, this is very important. What is the meaning of the term condition and restriction? Now, when you look at the law provides certain conditions in a manner that when we look at 16 subsection 2, just after this particular provision, we will find that the input tax credit is subject, the eligibility of the input tax credit is subject to 4 conditions. We'll have a look at the detail of that little later, but those are the conditions which are given in the act itself. What are the restrictions? The restrictions, as we will discuss in part 2, are contained in section 17, more particularly subsection 5 of section 17, which provides that certain supplies in respect of which the input tax credit is not eligible. So these are the conditions and these are the restrictions related to ITC which are flowing from the Act. Now, there are also certain conditions and restrictions which are not flowing through the Act, but which are provided by way of notifications. For example, we have the rate notification 11 of 2017, which provides for, let us take the case of restaurants, which says that the supplies of food, which is part of the composite supply of service by a restaurant, would be taxed at 5%. But it has a condition mentioned in that route notification, which says that the input tax credit shall not be available to such person. Now, this is what brings us to a very crucial issue related to 16.1. If we refer to 16.1 again, it says that the conditions and restrictions shall be prescribed. So either it may be contained in the Act. I mean, if they are not contained in the Act, they can be only be formulated by way of prescribing the same. The word prescribe is also defined in the GST law, where section 2 subsection 87 says prescribe would mean prescription by way of rules. Therefore, a view will emerge that if any conditions and restrictions which are not forming part of the Act, but which the legislator wants to enforce, can only be done by way of rules. Therefore, a view will emerge that in case of restaurants and builders, where the conditions of restricting the input tax credit, if they opt for the lower rates, that is 5% or 1% in case of builders, affordable if it is 1%, residential, non-affordable is 5%. So those are the conditions which are not flowing from the rules. Those are the conditions which have been prescribed by way of rate notification. So on this ground itself, friends, it can be contended that the law does not enable the government, does not enable the legislator, does not enable the executive rather to prescribe such kind of conditions by way of rate notification. The only way of doing it would have been by way of rules. Second aspect to this, which is again corollary to this, is that a condition and a restrictions are two different words. A condition implies that if there is a condition given in a rate notification, non-fulfilling of that condition would result into the availability of that particular entry under which the condition has been prescribed. And therefore, in my opinion, if let us say for restaurants, if they find that 5% is disadvantageous, if they find that 18% with credit is advantageous, in my opinion, they can opt for that 18% generic entry rather than sticking with the 5% entry, because the heading of that entry, the last column of that rate notification is condition. Non-fulfillment of that condition should result into the applicable rate of tax on that particular supply to be taxed under the generic provision. Even if, let us say, they have inserted an explanation in the rate notification which says that if some supply falls in that particular category, it will remain in that category. But even if you apply that explanation, you will find that for a supply to stick in that 5% category, it needs to be essentially complying with those conditions. So a non-compliance with those conditions itself would mean that that supply cannot stick in that category. And since it cannot stick in that category, it has to go back to our generic category. It has to go back to the residual category. And we have two beautiful Supreme Court decisions of HCL Limited and Indian Petrochemicals, where the courts have held that if there are two entries which are there for a particular assessee, and if the assessee finds that one is more beneficial to him, he can always opt for that beneficial category. That beneficial category cannot be restricted to him. So friends, I would submit that when we look at 16.1, when we look at conditions and restrictions which are not forming part of the Act, but which are forming part of the rate notification, the first contention would be that whether the law allows the executive to formulate such conditions by way of a rate notification and not by way of the rules. That is what the definition prescribed has been worded. And second would be that even if we assume that such conditions can be prescribed, can it be mandatorily enforced? Answer is clear no in both the cases, and therefore I would submit that such assessees which are having two options of availing either a lower rate with ITC restriction or a higher rate without ITC restriction, in my opinion, the assessee can indeed opt for the rate which is more beneficial to that assessee. Then let us go ahead. Let us see what 16.1 further says. It says the conditions and restrictions will be prescribed and the manner will be specified in section 49. Now, what section 49 deals with? Section 49 deals with the manner in which the credit would be available in the electronic credit ledger and the manner in which you can use that credit balance for paying the taxes. And we'll look at this in the second part when we refer to section 49 again, when we'll discuss rule 86A, which is sought to be inserted, which is trying to block the balance available in the electronic credit ledger. So at that time, we'll again come back to section 49 to see whether the said section, which is dealing with only a manner of utilization of credit, can such section go ahead and block the utilization of credit. So that aspect we'll consider in the next session. Then section 16.1 says that the assessee, the registered person, shall be entitled to take. Now this is very important, friends. The option, the entitlement of credit is an option. It is not mandatory. It is an option for an assessee. If he wants to go for that option, he can avail that credit. If he does not want to go for an option, and we will see later that in certain situations there are cases where it would be beneficial not to avail the credit rather than to avail the credit and then subject that credit to input tax credit restrictions that we'll look at when we go to section 17, more particularly 17 subsection 2. Another important word to notice here, and we will correlate this with 16.4, is the taking of the credit. So the word taking the credit is different from the word that the said amount, it will be credited into the electronic credit ledger. As you can see under section 16.1, it clearly brings out two different events. The first event of taking the credit and the second event of the taken credit, amount of that to be credited in the electronic credit ledger for the purpose of either utilization under section 49 or for the purpose of claiming refund, which are eligible under section 54. So the two stages are clearly identified under section 16 subsection 1 itself, the stage of taking the credit and the stage of the amount of that credit being credited in the electronic credit ledger. Friends, this will be very important when we look at 16.4. Next, the law says, 16.1 says the credit can be taken of the input tax charged. Now this is very important, friends. What is the definition of input tax? Now section 2 subsection 62 defines input tax. The controversy, we will straight away go to the controversy, because I am sure now since 2 years have passed, everyone is now aware about the basics of this law. So now, for example, the controversy is, let us take a case where a particular vendor has charged 18%, whereas the goods or the services, underlying goods or services, are actually classifiable and taxed at 12%. Can he avail the credit? Then can the recipient avail the credit of 18%, despite the fact that the actual applicable rate on those supplies is not 18%, it is lower than 18%? Friends, in my opinion, the answer is yes. If you carefully read the definition of input tax, it says it uses the word charged, not chargeable. So whatever amount that has been charged on an invoice, that would be the input tax, that the recipient need not worry, need not think of whether the tax was actually chargeable or not, and whether, if the tax was chargeable, whether the correct rate of tax has been charged or not. Those aspects are not to be examined by the registered recipient. He is entitled to take the credit of the entire amount which is of tax which is charged in an invoice. Second, friends, very important to understand, another controversial issue is, it is quite possible, and we've also come across when we carried out audits for a lot of companies, that, for example, the tax originally could have been charged under the head CGST or SGST, but the assessee by error has availed the credit under the head IGST or vice versa. Now, friends, what do you do in such situations? Do you go ahead now and reverse the credit that was earlier availed under the wrong head and try and avail the credit now under the correct head? Friends, if you follow that approach, the consequence would be that reversal would definitely happily be accepted by the department. But when you want to avail the credit now under the correct head, time-related restrictions that we will see under section 16.4 would come into play, and department would try and dispute the same. So friends, my understanding and my submission would be such that when you look at the word input tax, the input tax includes all the three taxes. The input tax does not only cover single tax. This definition, friends, is under the CGST Act. So the CGST law does not say that the input tax under CGST Act would be restricted to only central tax. Similarly, the IGST Act also borrows the definition of the input tax which is given under the CGST Act. And also, even if you see the state GST laws, the definition of input tax covers all the three taxes: central tax, state tax, as well as integrated tax. So friends, I would submit that a mere wrong head in which you have availed the credit should still be considered as a part of the definition of input tax, as it includes all the three heads. And therefore, I would submit that even if you have claimed it under the wrong head, that credit should be allowed, because at the end of the day, that credit is nothing but the input tax. Because originally, even if IGST credit would have been taken, that IGST also is part of the definition of input tax itself. And therefore, a mere error in putting that money in the wrong head when you file the return should not be detrimental to your claim of input tax credit. Having said that, I would definitely also submit that the accounting at the government's end would definitely get disturbed, because on one hand, that supplier might have paid IGST, on the other hand, the recipient might have claimed that under the wrong head. But friends, that is the issue at the end of the GSTN portal. We have to look at what the law is. The law is very clear. The definition of input tax covers all the three taxes. So I would submit that mere availment of the credit on the wrong head should not make it a disentitled credit, should not make it a credit which is not eligible. Third issue, friends, in this definition of input tax is in respect of reverse charge. Now, in respect of reverse charge, the time-related issue we will see slightly later. Here, what issue I want to draw your attention to is subclause B in this definition of input tax. If you carefully read, it says the tax payable, not the tax paid. So it is very important, friends, that in case of reverse charge, the credit is allowed of what is the tax payable under as per law, not the tax that you might have paid as per law. This brings us to an issue that, for example, there is a transporter, the applicable rate of tax is 5% if it is under reverse charge. Instead of 5%, you go ahead and pay, let us say 12%, assuming that that is the applicable rate. Friends, the credit of the 12% can be disputed by the department, because here the analogy that we applied for forward charge credits, where the language is tax charged, here the language is tax payable. Therefore, the department would contest that as far as reverse charge is concerned, the credit will be eligible only to the extent of tax which is actually payable, which would be 5% and not the 12% that you have actually paid in error. So that excess tax that you have paid, in my opinion, input tax credit may not be admissible, but the refund will surely be granted, because this is nothing but the tax which is paid in excess. It is considered as a deposit. We have series of decisions of Supreme Court as well as number of high courts to say that if something which was not payable has been paid, that amount would nothing but it is in the form of deposit. The government cannot retain that money, because under the constitution, government can only retain what is tax. And therefore, I would submit that if you come across case where if erroneously you have paid higher tax under RCM and also avail the credit, and if that is disputed, you can always have an option of agreeing to that contention of the department and then subsequently seeking the refund of that excess tax that you have paid, because now that is no longer the excess tax, it partakes the character of a deposit, and refund of that should be admissible. Now, friends, here also very important to also appreciate that the composition tax is not forming part of the definition of input tax, and that is very clear, because the credit of the composition tax is not permissible. So if you are buying goods or services from a composition supplier, credit of whatever tax that he might have paid to the government at 5%, or if it is a service provider at 6%, that would not be admissible to you. Friends, here one more important aspect, just I would also draw your attention to that the word input tax does not include transitional credits, because it clearly includes only credits in respect of the supply of goods or services. Now, transitional credit is not a credit in respect of supply of goods or services, because the supply of goods or services only came into existence post 1st July 2017, when that concept and the levy was introduced via GST law. So I would submit, this is very important, friends, not directly pertaining to this issue, but when you look at section 73 or 74, which provides for the power to issue the show cause notice and to adjudicate those show cause notices, the only power given by law is to the department is to identify any excess input tax credit which that person might have availed. The power is not there in the act to recover the excess transitional credit that person might have availed. Although there is rule 121, which also provides that in respect of transitional credits, you apply 73 or 74. But I would submit that since 73, 74 itself does not provide for the applicability for as far as transitional credits are concerned, even if you apply the rule, I believe that show cause notices cannot be issued for recovery of transitional credits which have been wrongly availed or availed in excess. There is a drafting lacuna. I am sure as the government understands and appreciates and realizes these errors, they are going to come back and probably they are going to try and cure this defect. But as long as that law stands as it is, that is the way I would read the particular provision. Now, friends, another important aspect. Now, let us move ahead in section 16, subsection 1. We have analyzed what is input tax. Now, we have to analyze that when the credit is available. It says the credit is available subject to the condition that you have received the goods or services. Now, whether the receipt of the goods or services has to be at the business premises for which he has obtained the registration. The answer is no. The law does not provide that the receipt has to be at the business premises where the registration has been obtained, unlike the excise regime. So, for example, a dealer registered in Gujarat goes to Maharashtra, he avails certain services, maybe he also avails where the service provider charges IGST at Gujarat address. The department cannot deny the ITC on the ground that the services has been availed in Maharashtra. The law provides that the services should be given to a registered person. The place where it should be given, the place where supply should be given is not mentioned in section 16.1, and therefore I would submit that as long as you can establish that you have received the services or the goods, underlying goods or services for which you want to avail the input tax credit, you should be entitled for it. The law further provides that the credit shall be available in respect of those goods or services which are used or intended to be used in the course or furtherance of the business. Now, friends, this is a very wide phrase. Let me share a couple of decisions for you to drive home this point. Yes. Now, for friends, as you are aware, in the earlier regime, the credit, be it Sunwed credit, be it the VAT credit, were not permissible in this broader sense, in a sense that if you can establish the nexus with business, the credit should be allowed. In the earlier regime, the nexus had to be a narrow nexus in terms of either it should be in relation to manufacturing, it should be in relation to provision of service, or it should be in relation to the sale of goods under the VAT law. In the VAT law, we had the concept of business. We had the concept where the credit was linked with the concept of business. But that also, for example, in Gujarat VAT law, we had a very narrow definition of raw material and capital goods, which in a way restricted the credits only in respect of those goods which are actually attributable to the main core activity of the dealer, and goods or services which are not related to the core activity, the credit was not permissible. In GST law, the scenario is totally different. In GST law, the definition is very wide. It says even if it is in the course or furtherance of business, credit will be available. The term business has been defined under section 2, subsection 17 of the CGST Act. It's a very wide definition. It includes not only the main activity, but it also includes any activity which is ancillary to the main activity. Now, friends, one of the landmark decisions to understand the word for the purpose of business would be of the Honorable Supreme Court in case of Malayalam Plantations 53 ITR 140, where the Honorable Court held that the further of business, that the term for the purpose of business is a very wide in scope. It is no longer linked to the profits which a particular businessman makes out of incurring those expenses. So, in my opinion, the department cannot say that if you have, let us say, the particular assessee has incurred certain CSR expense, maybe due to COVID-19 pandemic. Now, there may not be any link of incurring of that expense with the earning of the profit of that business. But still, if the businessman finds that this expense is necessary, for example, to incur certain expenses in the community where the business is situated, where Companies Act demands that you incur certain expense mandatorily under the provisions of law, I would submit that the nexus with the earning of profit is not required, as long as the businessman, in his wisdom, in his prudence, thinks that this expense is necessary for the purpose of running his business. The credit should be admissible. The officer cannot step into the shoes of the businessman and decide whether the particular expense was required or not. It is the prerogative of the businessman. It is not the prerogative of the tax officer to run the business and to dictate how a particular decision or how the particular expense is to be incurred. So this decision has considered all those aspects, and they have held that for the purpose of business no longer requires the nexus with the profit earning of in relation to that particular expense, and it is the prerogative of the businessman to decide whether he considers it prudent to incur that expense or not. Officer cannot substitute the judgment of the businessman with his own personal judgment, with his own personal opinions. Now, friends, let us again go back to 16.1. So we have discussed the aspect of registered person. We have discussed the aspect of conditions and restrictions, the manner in which it can be prescribed. We have discussed section 49 briefly of how the law provides you to utilize the balance. We have also discussed the aspect of input tax, what it covers, what it excludes, how the various controversial issues are to be dealt with. And then we also saw the aspect of business. Friends, one more aspect to be seen here is the word used or intended to be used. So the credit is not allowed only when you actually make the use for the purpose of business. Credit will also be allowed if there is an intention to use it for the purpose of business. That is why when in the part 2, when we deal with section 17 subsection 1, you will find that the word intended for is deliberately not used in subsection 1 of section 17, which says that if the goods or services are used for personal consumption for non-business use, credit will not be eligible. So the way the law has been structured is, and the way in which I would read it, that 16(1) allows the credit even if I can establish that there was an intention to use for the purpose of business. If eventually it is found that it is used for non-business purposes, then 17(1) would come into play, and the restrictions and the rules given under 42 and 43, which gives us the formula of identifying and ascertaining the ITC, which will be restricted, needs to be worked out. So the word intention is very important here. Also, friends, in my PPT, I also referred to the very good decision of Steel Authority of India, Supreme Court decision, where they have said the intended for use word is a subjective phrase. It is based on the intention, which is the state of the mind of that businessman. And to identify the state of the mind, it is again the businessman has to establish that whatever goods or whatever services that he had purchased were intended for use. If actual use is not for the purpose of business, as we discussed, 17(1) would apply, and ITC needs to be then restricted by applying the mechanism given under the rules. Friends, last part of 16(1) and then we go to 16(2) is, as I had also submitted earlier, the law says that the amount of input tax credit that has been taken shall be credited to the electronic credit ledger. So again, I would repeat that the aspect of taking the credit and the aspect of the amount of credit that you have taken to be credited in the electronic credit ledger for enabling the businessman to use the credit or to seek refund of the same are two different aspects. Please don't confuse yourself with the aspect of taking the credit and the aspect of that credit getting reflected in the electronic credit ledger by way of filing GSTR 3B. We'll again come back to this aspect when we go to 16 subsection 4. Friends, there is one more issue that I wanted to discuss, that whether the credit of other states can be claimed. I would submit that the credit of other states can be claimed. I will not go at length to discuss because the time is very finite. We don't have time to really go and discuss in detail. But I would just draw your attention to the definition of input tax that we saw earlier, that as discussed includes all the three taxes. It does not differentiate between a state tax of other states as far as the CGST and IGST laws are concerned. So I would submit that under the CGST and IGST laws, you should be able to take the input tax credit of even the SGST of other states. CGST as such is a single levy, it's a single act. So for that also, I would submit that under all the three laws, input tax credit of that would be permissible. You may say that what about 2A? You may say that what about the government balances? But I would submit, friends, that is the problem of the government. That is not our problem. We have to see what the law is. We cannot go back and solve each and every problem that we come across. That is for the government to think and consider that why in 2A this is not reflected, or why in the GSTN portal the settlement of such amount will not be done. But the way law is before us, clearly the credit of other states should be admissible. Now, friends, let us go to 16 subsection 2. Now, 16 subsection 2 talks about the conditions which a particular registered person is supposed to satisfy in order to be entitled for credit. Friends, please understand, 16.2 does not use the word entitlement to take the credit. It only uses the word entitlement of credit. So a notion is there that only if I satisfy the 4 conditions, I can take the credit is a wrong contention. I would submit that these 4 conditions are to be looked at, not necessarily prior to the stage of taking the credit. Most of these 4 conditions, as we will discuss shortly, can be also complied even after taking the credit. And why I'm saying that, let us see the 4 conditions. First condition is you must have the document on the basis of which you can avail the credit. Obviously, this document is a must before taking the credit. Even if you go to Rule 36, which provides that the person can avail the credit provided he has the documents with him and he has filed GSTR 2. Now, since GSTR 3 has been buried, GSTR 2 will not remain alive. So I would submit that the first condition is a prerogative. It needs to be satisfied before availing the credit, and that is what even Rule 36 would tell us. Now let us see the other three conditions. Second condition, he must have received the goods or services. Now this condition, friends, I would submit not necessary that this has to be always complied before taking the credit. A small illustration would suffice that, for example, I have today paid for the AMC charges for the entire year. I have received the invoice, which is the document contained under the first condition. Now the services would not be received today. The services would be received over a period of next 1 year. Can we say that I cannot take the credit unless I completely receive the services, and only after the end of the first year I can take the credit? Friends, that would be wrong, for the reason that 16.2 is dealing with the entitlement of credit, not for taking the credit. So this particular clause has to be seen as an anti-avoidance clause, in a way that if it is ultimately found that I have not received the underlying goods or services, if it is a fraudulent invoice, if it is a fake invoice, bogus invoice, then only the credit can get restricted. Otherwise, this condition cannot be applied or need not be satisfied before the stage of taking the credit. The stage of taking the credit and the stage of entitlement of credit are two different stages. So you can take the credit as soon as you have the document, and then subsequently, if you can satisfy that it was a genuine transaction, you have received the goods or the services, I would submit that that credit cannot be denied, or interest cannot be charged for the early availment of the credit. Condition C deals with the actual payment condition. Again, this is an anti-avoidance condition, which says that if the tax has not been actually paid by the concerned vendor, credit would not be entitled. Friends, here also I would submit we have history now before us of the VAT era. We had earlier the Maharashtra Bombay High Court decision, which was an adverse decision, but then we have Delhi High Court, which has beautifully explained the law on this aspect, and they have held in case of Arise India that this condition under Article 14 will not survive. It has to be read down, and it will only apply in cases where the credits have been availed on fraudulent transactions, on fake transactions. And the decision of Arise India, where number of petitioners was there. One of the petitioner, Arise India, the department had not alleged that the transaction in that assessment were fraudulent, and therefore the department filed an SLP before the Supreme Court against that only Arise India decision, and not against the other petitions, because in other petitions there were also allegations in the assessment that the transactions could be fraudulent, and therefore the High Court remanded the matter back. But in Arise India, there was no such contention that the transactions were fraudulent, and therefore the department filed an SLP, which again Supreme Court dismissed it. And after that also we have Rajasthan High Court decision, which has followed the Delhi High Court decision, and they have held that this condition is an anti-avoidance condition. It has to be looked at in a manner that if there is an allegation, if there is an onus, initial onus, which department has to satisfy that the transaction is fraudulent, and then the condition can be applied, and the onus will shift to the recipient who has availed the credit to submit and satisfy that the transaction was genuine. So that is how we would look at this condition C. And condition D, that he has furnished the return under section 39. Also, friends, as we discussed earlier, this condition, if it has to be fulfilled before the taking of the credit, none of the registered person in the entire country can take the credit before filing the return. So for example, January month credit, I can only take after filing the return for the month of January. So in short, for January month, I can take the credit only in February and use it for February payment. Is it the intention of the law? The answer is clear, no. And therefore, all these three conditions I would submit, B, C, and D, are anti-avoidance conditions, and for particularly B and C are anti-avoidance. D is the procedural part of the availment of the credit, where by filing the return, you get that credit amount transferred in your electronic credit ledger. So I would submit that it is in that context that this B, C, and D has to be read. Only condition A needs to be satisfied before actually availing the credit. In end of day, if it is found, once you avail the credit, but eventually if you get stuck in any of those B, C, and D conditions, if the transactions are fraudulent, if the transactions are bogus, then obviously you will not be entitled for the credit, and the consequences under section 73 and 74 would follow. Now, friends, to support this contention that we have already discussed, that these are the conditions, three conditions can be complied subsequently. Only first condition needs to be complied before availing the credit. It can drive support from the C-form analogy that we had in the CST law, where initially the sales were made at concessional rate, and then the conditions of receiving the form to enable the sale at concessional rate was complied. Also, we have the Supreme Court decision of KRCS Balkrishna Chetty, where they have the word subject to, which is again used in section 16.2, has to be read as conditional upon. It cannot be read in a manner to say that only if you comply those four conditions, only thereafter you can take the credit. I would submit that the taking of the credit can be done on the receipt of invoice in a genuine transaction. Rest of these three conditions, even if they are complied afterwards, after taking the credit, that will amount to the credit now being actually legally entitled, and hence I would submit that there should not be any issue. Now, friends, documentation, as you are all aware, time is short. I will not spend much time, but under forward charge, you need tax invoice, debit note, you need bill of entry, you need ISD invoice. For reverse charge, if it is from a registered supplier, you need a tax invoice where tax payable would have been reflected, but you would have paid the tax under reverse charge. And this is most important, which I have found, which is there is gross non-compliant at the industry level, is where reverse charge liability is discharged on the supplies which are received from unregistered suppliers. Friends, law asks you to prepare the invoice under section 31(3)(f), and that is the invoice which is the base document for you to avail the credit. So friends, kindly ensure that the compliance is done with this condition, because the non-preparation of the document, although it will be a procedural breach, but at the departmental level, they will think it is a substantial breach, and they will try and go ahead and try and deny the credit. So to avoid this is the problem which is clearly avoidable by just making the self invoice and keeping it in the record. So I would submit that that prudent road should be taken rather than the road of unnecessarily inviting litigation. Now, these are the decisions of receipt of goods and services. I would only draw your attention to this very recent and good decision of Goodart Steel Private Limited. It can be possible that, for example, the department conducts the audit. They do not challenge the subsequent use of those goods on which you avail the credit, or the subsequent supply that you have made of those goods, but they only say challenge it that you have not received the goods or services and hence credit is not available. That contention would be fallacious, because if the department is not going to challenge the subsequent use of those goods, subsequent supply of those goods, obviously department cannot say that you have not received the goods, because without receipt of the goods you cannot make the subsequent supply, and therefore without warranting, without challenging the subsequent supply, the receipt cannot be challenged unilaterally to say that you have not received the goods or services. So it's a very good decision where if you can establish through your inventory records, through the transport receipts, through the toll booth receipts, to say that you have received the goods, and you have also made further supply of the goods either by manufacturing something and then supplying it, or maybe by doing trading activity. If you can establish that through your records, then I would submit that department would not be able to deny the credit on any presumptions or assumptions. Now, friends, 16.2 also had this condition, which is again a condition which is at across the board. There is gross non-compliant. That is this 180 days condition. The law says that the proviso is there, second proviso to 16.2, which says that if the recipient fails to pay the amount of the taxable value and the tax charge thereon within 180 days from the date of invoice, then the law says that that amount shall be added to the output tax liability along with the interest in the manner as may be prescribed. And then we have Rule 37, which prescribes the manner, and it says that that amount has to be added to GSTR 2. Now, we have a number of contentions here. First, let us say whether it will apply to RCM. Answer is no. The Rule 37 clearly says RCM credits are not governed by this 180 days condition. Whether it will apply to imports, no. Imports, IGST credit on imports is also not governed by this condition. You may see why imports is excluded when Rule 37 is silent. I would submit that when you look at this proviso, it says value of supply and tax payable thereon. In case of imports, when you discharge IGST, there is no value of supply, because Section 5(1) IGST proviso says that the levy and the collection of on the import of goods is under the customs law. So under the customs valuation, the goods are valued, and there is no tax payable as such under the GST law. So I would submit that import of goods would again not be covered by this 180 days condition. Now, friends, they have used the word fail to pay. Now, fail to pay is different from not able to pay or non-payment within 180 days. The word fail is important because the fail would signify that there should be a liability and obligation to pay, and there is a failure to discharge that obligation. So I would submit that in contracts where the obligation to discharge the payment is beyond 180 days, a contention can be taken that there is no failure to pay, and therefore ITC under this should not be reversed. Retention money, friends, we have the decision of under the service tax era of Hindustan Zinc, where they have said that retention money cannot be equated with non-payment of the consideration, looking at the spirit and the intent behind the provision, and therefore they have held that the retention money would not invite the restriction. Book adjustments, friends, book adjustments, if you make the payment through book adjustments, it should be permitted. For the sake of brevity, you may refer to circular of number 122 of 2010 of service tax law, where they have beautifully explained that book adjustment is also a manner of payment, and therefore, if you pay by book adjustment, then also it would satisfy, and 180 days criteria would not apply. Schedule 1 transactions, obviously this condition cannot be applied because those are the transactions which are fundamentally without consideration. For example, branch transfer. So definitely there will be no payment between the two branches, and therefore 180 days condition does not apply to such transactions. Friends, one of the most important aspect, and that is where I want to draw your attention to, if you carefully read this provision, friends, it says that once you cross this 180 days window from the date of invoice and you have failed in making the payment, it says that the amount of the ITC that you availed earlier shall be added to his output tax liability. Friends, this is what is very important. The way the law was structured is that this is not reversal of input tax credit the way we understand it normally in our day-to-day conversation. This essentially was to be added to my output tax. So it became an output tax. It is not an outward supply. There is a difference between outward supply and output tax. This ITC was only to be added in the output tax liability and interest thereon. Now, what is this interest? When you look at section 50 subsection 1, it says that when there is a failure to pay the tax, the output tax, that is where that section got attracted, and that is where interest also got applicable on such transaction. And that is why, if you friends look at Rule 37, it says it was only through GSTR 2 that this amount was to be added to the output tax directly and not reversed from the electronic credit ledger, which is also maintained online. And therefore, friends, I would submit that in absence of GSTR 2, there is no manner in which this amount can be added to your output tax liability. In 3B, one may contain that you can show this as output tax liability rather than ITC reversal to comply. Friends, that is also not possible, because if you look at 3B, it is only asking on the outward side the supply that you have made of outward supplies that you have made and the tax payable on those outward supplies. So you cannot in 3B say that I have made an outward supply of 100, but instead of 18, I will put 28, because 18 is the normal tax on outward supply and 10 is maybe such ITC which is supposed to be reversed. That would be wrong, because even GSTR 3B does not ask you, does not provide for any table to put this amount and transfer this amount to the output tax liability. So I would submit that this amount cannot be transferred to output tax liability instead of in absence of mechanism. And since it cannot be an output tax liability, there is no question of levy of interest on it, because section 50 subsection 1 only applies if there is a delay in payment of output tax. It does not apply if there is a non-reversal under section 16 subsection 2 second proviso. No other provisions of section 50 also provide for the interest in such situation, in such eventuality. So I would submit that in absence of a mechanism to transfer this money to output tax and then to apply interest on that is absolutely missing. It is not there, and therefore this reversal also, if someone wants to do right now, it is not possible for that particular registered person to comply. And we have decisions where the courts have said that in absence of machinery mechanism to really comply with the levy or the charging provision or the ITC related provision in the Act, the machinery, the main provision would fail, the applicability of that would fail. And therefore, on this ground also, it can be contended that this reversal, this addition to output tax liability, if we use technical language, is not permissible, and therefore there is no question of any interest being added on such amount if the particular registered person has not added it. Now, friends, this brings us to 16 subsection 4. Probably I have now 10-15 minutes left only, so we will quickly run through this provision before I conclude my talk. Now, 16 subsection 4 provides for the time limits. It says that the registered person shall not be entitled to take the credit in respect of an invoice or a debit note within a stipulated time. What is the stipulated time? In a nutshell, it says, for example, if you are talking about financial year 1920, then 16.4, if you read apparently, it would imply that invoice which is dated 1920 or a debit note which is issued in respect of invoice which is dated 1920, you cannot take the credit in respect of such invoice or such debit note beyond 20th October 2020. That is the due date of filing return under section 39 for the month of September, because the law here indeed compares this date with the actual annual return filing date. But as you all know, annual return for 1920 would definitely be filed much beyond this 20th October deadline, and therefore 20th October would be the end date for taking the credit in respect of 1920. Now, friends, this is what the law is. Then they added one proviso for financial year 17-18 to say that for first year of GST, they are giving an additional time up to due date of filing return for the month of March. That would be 20th April 2019, to say that additional time you can avail the credit for 17-18, but it has a condition that the invoices for which you want to avail the credit during this additional time frame needs to be uploaded by the suppliers by filing GSTR1, and that also needs to be done by the due date of filing GSTR1 for March 19, so that would be 11th April 2019. So this is the law. Now, what are the issues? There are a whole host of issues that you will come across when you try and apply this to real life scenarios. First and foremost, whether this apply to imports, it is the easiest question to first answer. Answer is clear, no, it does not apply to imports. It only applies to credits which are in respect of invoice or debit note. The credit on imports are claimed on the strength of bill of entry. They are not claimed on the strength of invoice or debit note. So therefore, the imports are not governed by this provision. But that is fine. The real issue now comes that many SSEs, I can tell you 6-7 instances where this hurdle will come. Instance number 1, for example, someone is not able to file 3B in time, and for March month 3B, he is filing that 3B, let us say in December 2020, March 23B, because of COVID-19 pandemic, because of financial issues at the end of the supplier, he is not able to pay the tax, and hence he is not able to file the return by the 20th October, and he is able to file the return only after that date. So that will be a real life scenario. There will be scenario where, for example, person has availed the credit in the books of accounts, but by error, the accountant has not been able to reflect the credit in the 3B that he has filed, and now the time limit has crossed. Third could be when the GST audit is carried out of that particular taxpayer by the chartered accountant or a cost accountant. The chartered accountant or cost accountant would come across scenarios where certain credits, although eligible, were not availed by that particular person, or maybe he might have also recorded that in his books of accounts, but he did not mention it in 3B, and therefore when he reconciled the ITC balances of the online ledger with the books of accounts, he found discrepancies, and that is where also he comes across cases where certain ITCs have not been taken. There can be GST portal related issues where the portal right now in certain assesses is not allowing him to file the return, and therefore in such scenario also is not able to file the returns in time and avail the credit. Now, what to do in all those practical scenarios? There can be last very interesting scenario. For example, there are high court rulings which takes a view which is beneficial to the taxpayer and says that credit is available in certain circumstances. For example, there is an Orissa High Court decision in case of Safari Retreat. Now, I'm not going to get into the technicalities of it, but that decision has wide ramifications running into crores and crores of rupees when it comes to the real estate sector. Now, if your client is in the real estate sector, if he has made certain purchases, which now the High Court says credit is eligible, Supreme Court, we don't know what they will eventually do. But as on date, we have a ruling which says credit is eligible. So that particular person wants to avail it now, and maybe under protest, he wants to reverse it and reserve the right to reclaim the credit as and when that issue is finally settled. What should he do in such circumstances? So we have so many examples, live cases where the 16.4 comes into play. So friends, in this background, I will tell you my submissions on 16.4. First, let us understand 16.2 and 16.4 and let us put both of them together. See, what 16.2 says that a person is entitled for credit if he satisfies those 4 conditions, and 16.4 says that a person cannot take the credit beyond the stipulated time frame. Now, first and foremost, friends, if you carefully read 16.2, it says notwithstanding anything contained in entire section 16. So 16.2 in a way overrides 16.4 because subsection 4 is part of section 16 itself. So one contention can be that 16.2 overrides 16.4, and 16.2 does not have the time limit as far as the determination of entitlement of credit is concerned, and hence if my credit is duly entitled under section 16.2, how can the same be blocked under section 16.4 merely for the purpose of availing the same, taking the same, when 16.2 has a non-obstante clause? Second contention, department might contend to this argument that fine, 16.2 deals with entitlement of credit, 16.4 deals with taking of the credit, both are separate aspects. So he may say that if you satisfy conditions under 16.2, you are indeed entitled for the credit, But since you have not taken the credit within time, 16.4 time limit would apply, and therefore on this ground credit is not admissible. Friends, this view also will be fallacious for the reason that when you look at 16.2, it has 4 conditions. As we saw earlier, the last condition is filing of the return. So when the credit entitlement is discussed, as you are aware, when you file the return, the credit ultimately gets reflected in the return and gets transferred to the electronic credit ledger. So I would submit that when 16.2 decides about the entitlement of credit, it not only takes care of the fundamental conditions for entitlement, but it also takes into its ambit even the condition of ensuring that that amount which is entitled is indeed credited into the electronic credit ledger by way of filing the return. So 16.2 in a way is a complete code by itself. So I would submit that to say that 16.4 only deals with taking of the credit and 16.2 does not deal with taking of the credit would again be fallacious. 16.2 not only deals with the entitlement of the credit, but as a subset of entitlement of credit, it also deals with the taking of the credit by ensuring that if the return is filed, that credit is entitled. So I would submit that 16.2 would override 16.4 and therefore the time limit would not apply. Second contention would be that if you see 16.4, the nexus of putting the time limit by linking it with the return under section 39 has a deep history and a deep meaning behind it. Where that meaning comes out, if you go to the GST settlement of fund rules, there are rules which have been formulated. We don't normally read those rules because in our day-to-day practice, we don't care about how the government settles their funds. But it is very interesting and I would urge everyone to read those rules. It gives you very good ideas about why certain provisions are made in a way in which they are there. So for example, in this particular issue, if you go to rule 4 of the settlement of fund rules, you will find the government has clearly put the intent behind making 16.4. They say that GSTN would provide the details of the unavailed credit by the 20th of the September of the succeeding financial year to ensure that whatever funds which are lying, for example, there is a B2B invoice, a supplier has paid the tax, the recipient has not availed the credit, and by GSTR 1, 2 and 3 system, the government is now aware about such money which has been paid by the suppliers but not availed by the registered recipients. For the apportionment of that money, rules have been created which clearly brings out how that money would be apportioned between the central government and the state governments. So this is the history behind linking GSTR 3 with 16.4, because only in GSTR 1, 2 and 3 regime the government can really ascertain such unavailed money which needs to be apportioned between the center and the state government. Now friends, we are in 3B regime, we are not in 3 regime. In 3B, council has said when they introduced 3B and even as recently as in the 39th council meeting that this is a summary return. This is not a transaction level return. So friends, I would submit that in 3B regime, which is a summary return, it is not possible for 16.4 to apply and to apportion the money because the government can never know on 20th October of the next financial year that how much of the money which is lying on in their account needs to be apportioned, since this amount would not be availed by the concerned taxpayers, by the concerned recipients. And friends, for this also they amended the IGST law. If you remember, subsection 2 capital A came to be inserted in the IGST Act by way of the 2018 amendment to say that since government does not have any clue as to how this money will eventually be retained by the government and how much will flow in terms of availment of the credit, they said that on ad hoc basis we will do the apportionment of this money. So friends, government has realized that in 1, 2, 3 and 3 system, there is no way the 16.4 time limit can be applied. And therefore, just by saying that 3B is now written under section 39 would not mean, looking at the history of 16.4 and the apportionment rules that we just referred, the 3B cannot be substitute 3 as far as 16.4 is concerned. And hence on this ground also it can be contended that this time limit would not apply. Friends, there is one more contention that Rule 61.5, which was retrospectively amended and which now says that 3B is written under section 39 and therefore 16.4 time limit would apply. Also, to my mind, can only be applied if at all, if you consider it as a valid. As we discussed earlier, it is not a valid provision, but even if you consider it as valid, then also it should not disturb your credits which are accrued before 9th before 9th October 2019, the credits for which you are entitled to under section 16(2) by satisfying those 4 conditions, if you are entitled to those credits before 9th October 2019, we have 2 very good decisions of Eicher Motors and Daiichi Karkaria, where Supreme Court has said that once the credit has been vested, here if you comply with 16(2), I would submit that the credit has been duly vested, and once the credit has been vested, the said credit cannot be taken away by way of such a retrospective amendment of the rules by saying that 3B is now a return under section 39. One more contention, friends, is law cannot compel doing the impossibilities. Now, friends, section 39 does not link the payment date with, does not say that return can be filed only after making the payment. It merely links the due date of making the payment with the due date of filing the return. It is the GSTN law, not the GST law, because in this country we have 2 different laws. One is the GST law, that is actually the law, and then we have the GSTN law, which we consider it to be a law, but unfortunately it is not the law. It is a view of the system analyst who is sitting in the GST department and who is trying to interpret the law and put the filters in the portal. Now, friends, the portal, the filter that has been put in the portal where it does not allow me to file the return creates this impossibility that in March I want to file the return, but I don't have the money to pay the tax, and therefore I am not able to file the return within time. I file the return after 20th October when I have the money available with me. Now, when I reflect the credit in such return, law cannot say that this credit is time barred because the portal itself did not give me an opportunity of reflecting the credit by filing the return on due basis. Last, friends, this is again very important contention, is 16(4) applies at the stage of taking the credit and not at the stage of crediting the money in the electronic credit ledger. As discussed earlier, 16(1) clearly identifies 2 separate stages, one stage of taking the credit, another stage of reflecting that amount in the electronic credit ledger. Now, friends, because of paucity of time, I will not be able to take you through the entire mechanism of what is taking the credit, but I would just submit, if you look at section 37, 38, 39, 41, 42, and 43, a clear picture will emerge that first the assessee takes the credit in his records that he is supposed to maintain under section 35. That credit is then reflected in the return. That credit which is reflected in the return is credited on provisional basis under section 41 to the electronic credit ledger. Then that credit was supposed to go undertake matching, and after matching that amount would become final credit. Now that matching process is suspended, but the process of reflecting the amount and getting that amount credited in the electronic credit ledger is present. It's a distinct process. It is not akin to a process of availing the credit. So friends, I would submit that if you have taken the credit in your books of accounts, for example, in March, if you have taken the credit in your March books of accounts in the records that you are maintaining, because for ITC, your books of accounts ledger itself would be a record for ITC availment. If you are maintaining that properly, if you have taken that in time, then I would submit that mere delay in filing of 3B would not make the credit disentitled, would not make the credit violate 16(4). Now, lastly, friends, I would touch upon the RCM cases, credit under the RCM, whether 16(4) applies or not. I would submit, friends, 16(4) would not apply to cases where credit is availed on the self-invoice which are made under RCM. I have reasons to support this theory. What are the reasons, friends? Let us go back to 16(4) and read it carefully. What 16(4) says? It applies to an invoice for supply of goods or services. Friends, when we look at the mechanism of self-invoice, the manner of preparing the invoice under section 31(3)(f), it says it is an invoice for the receipt of goods and services. It is not an invoice for supply of goods or services. So friends, the recipient under reverse charge under 9394 does not become the deemed supplier. He remains a recipient only. So the invoice that he is making is not for supply of goods or services. That invoice is for receipt of goods and services, and that invoice is not sought to be covered under 16(4). The proviso also throws light to this issue. If you see the proviso which gave that extended time limit for 1718, it only talks about those invoices which are to be reported in GSTR1, because the extended time limit was only granted to invoices with the condition that those invoices are uploaded by the supplier in section 37 subsection 1. Now, friends, the reverse charge invoice from unregistered supplier that you make is not an invoice, the details of which are to be submitted in GSTR1, which is uploaded under section 30, under provisions of section 37 subsection 1. So, friends, I would submit that even the proviso clearly brings out the point that the intent of providing this restriction is only qua the invoices which are to be uploaded by the registered suppliers under GSTR1 and not to provisions not to reverse charge invoice. And friends, this also clearly comes out from the fact that this 16.4 has been formulated to apportion the money which is lying with the government, which has not yet been claimed. The said aspect cannot apply to RCM invoices because under the RCM, the tax is discharged by the recipient itself who avails the credit. And therefore, friends, I would submit that 16.4 cannot apply to RCM invoices under RCM as far as the supplies, underlying supplies are from unregistered suppliers. Friends, I would end by just saying one more aspect to this issue, that even if you apply this provision, let us say if the officer does not agree to your contention, if he wants to apply the provision, the same would apply qua the date of document. It would not apply qua the date of receipt of underlying supplies. It is very clear because 16.4, the entire restriction is qua the date of documents. 16.4 restrictions are not qua the date of underlying supplies. So there is one theory which says the language used that it pertains to financial year, but I would submit that the word pertains to is only talking in the context of document date. It cannot be read to mean that actual date on which you have received the goods or services are to be seen. So friends, with that, I complete my discussion on the entire section 16 and the controversial issues under that. In the next session, we are going to discuss section 17. If there is exempt supplies, what are the issues? The block credit 17.5, we will look at some interesting case studies. And also we will discuss the rule 36.4 as well as rule 86 capital A. So with that, friends, I rest my speech. I again thank the AIFTP, Nikita ma'am, all the senior committee members of the association for giving me this wonderful opportunity. Thank you, friends.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Can we go to the queries one by one? Bye-bye, can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So would you be able to read on the chat box, or you want me to read?
Just a second.
Because it is full of queries, to be very frank.
Just a second. I'm not able to see the
Okay,
chat.
wait, I will read one by one. One is by Mr. Keyur. I'm going last first, then I'll go to the IGST RCM paid on import of service in cash with GSTR 9 of 1718. No DRC 3 filed, has no clarity and how and where to claim credit. If we file DRC 3, then it will not appear in ECL. Can we file DRC 3 and claim credit of March 20, 3B and 0.4A2 without showing in 0.31D, 3.1D? That's a clauses in the form is.
Okay. Yeah, certainly. So as we discussed in my presentation also, as I said, in case of reverse charge, I believe it is an import of service. There are two aspects to it. One is you have to make a self-invoice and that becomes a document for claiming the credit. And the aspect of making the payment is a different aspect. It's a separate aspect. So if you are going to make the self-invoice now, I believe you will be entitled for the credit. You can claim it in GSTR 3B itself as a regular input tax credit, the way you would have shown. Otherwise, any RCM credit that you are claiming in regular course.
Okay. There is one question about GST credit not claimed in 3B in 1819. Can I take now?
So at length, I have explained how 16.4 restrictions should be read into. So I believe, considering all the contention that we discussed, you can claim the credit for 1819 as well.
Okay. Which is the relevant notification under IGST similar to notification number 5 of 17 of CGST, which exempts from Regis where entire tax is payable under RCM? What is this? Exempt from Regis. If no such notification exists, whether an advocate rendering interstate supply of service having aggregate more than 20 lakhs requires to be, oh my God, advocates are not required. I'm sorry, I read it also. Advocates are exempt, sir. Who is this? Oh, then 1 minute. There are so many of them. Can ITC of IGST paid on import for month of February 19 of goods after September 19 return? People are, Mr. Dilip Patwa, is he there? Can you unmute Dilip Patwa? Raise your hand, we can unmute you. Okay, because the query is not written correctly. All right, Mr. JP. Dilip Patwa ji, put up your query fast.
Actually, import was done in the month of February 19, and IGST at the rate of 18% was paid. But somehow it was I forget to take that credit of the same in the month of September 19.
No, certainly import 16.4 does not apply to credit of IGST paid on import of goods, because you pay it via bill of entry, and bill of entry is not the document which is covered under 16.4. So no time limit applies to claiming credits on bill of entry.
So I can take the credit in the month of March 28th, 3B.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.
Okay, can I claim credit of RCM relating to 17-18 which is paid in 21-22?
Yes, certainly.
Can it be? Okay, chalo. 21-22 nahi 20-21, but anyway.
Next
Anil
question,
Ji.
Manoj Agrawal. You can ask the question, please.
आपने unmute किया उसको?
Yeah. Manoj Agrawal.
Manoj Agarwal ji, are you there?
Yeah. Hello.
Please speak your query.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yeah.
My query is, in case of interstate supply of goods or services, which is under RCM, what type of tax is payable, IGST or CGST and SGST? In case of interstate supply of goods or services covered under RCM, recipient has to pay IGST or CGST, SGST.
No, so if the location of supplier is in other state and place of supply is in your state where you are a registered person, where you have availed such underlying supplies which are liable for payment of tax under RCM, then you will have to pay IGST, because there is an IGST notification issued under reverse charge.
No, sir. Abhay bhai, actually there is a counter view that in case of RCM, all the provisions, a recipient becomes the deemed supplier. That's why I'm asking. Because
So that is why I said in my presentation, 9394 recipient does not become a deemed supplier. There is no deeming fiction in law to make recipient as a deemed supplier.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Next, Amit ji, one by one announce करके unblock करो.
Yeah. Next, Ravi Shankar AV, please.
Sir, there was earlier a provision of RCM to be paid on URD purchases. Subsequently, it was removed. That means on URD purchase, there was no RCM. But my client was also paying RCM in that non-liability period and also claiming the ITC. So someone is of the view that will that ITC claim be disallowed, or can it be disallowed?
Right. So as we discussed during my talk, I said that the word definition of input tax only covers the tax payable under section 9.3 or 9.4. So I submitted that credit, in my opinion, is likely to be disallowed if it was not payable. But as I also shared that you can claim refund of it, because then it partakes the character of a deposit, because if something was not payable and you paid that, so you should apply for the refund, because there is a legal judgments to support that time limit would not apply, but then we have conflicting decisions on that. So I would submit that if 2 years have not passed, it is better to reverse the ITC and apply for the refund rather than taking on the risk of subjecting this to departmental audits and eventually this amount getting reversed and the time limit for refund also getting exhausted.
But we've already claimed it in the returns, monthly returns, as ITC.
No, right. So you can reverse it now, and then you can claim the refund on the ground that this amount was paid in excess. And now, in fact, they have amended the rule also. With now there is a separate form that they would also, I think they have come out on the portal, which allows you to file refund of any excess paid tax. So if you have paid anything in excess, by using that form, you should be able to claim the cash refund of it.
No, but that ITC is already being claimed and used for payment of tax for the earlier return that was filed.
No, so that is why you now reverse, you pay it up. Because you have, see, let us say 100 rupees is the tax which was not payable, but you have paid. You have claimed that as a credit, and because you have claimed that as credit, you did not pay an output tax of 100 rupees because you must have adjusted this credit against that output tax liability.
Yes.
So now you pay 100 rupees and claim refund of 100 back from the government by filing a refund application saying that this amount was not payable at all.
But how should that tax be paid? Should we pay it along with interest because they're paying it late?
See, interest, I would submit, as far as interest is concerned, section 50, if you read, As far as output tax is concerned, section 50 subsection 1 would get attracted and interest liability would be imposed.
So we
Okay,
have to
move on. Next. No counter query, please. A lot of other queries.
Next, Nikhil Gandhi.
Sir. Good afternoon, ma'am. My client is manufacturing oil manufacturing, and he purchased a tempo for movement of goods. Now, ITC will be claim or not?
No, so that in second part we are going to discuss this at length, but I would submit 17.5. The credit in respect of transportation of vehicles which are used for transportation of goods is not restricted.
Next.
Next, Advocate Dipesh.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir. I have two little questions. My one of my client has wrongly mentioned while filing the return B2B in place of B2C.
So what this has to do with ITC? I mean, I don't understand what exactly is the issue.
Dealer, while filing the return, he has made a mistake. The exact entry was to be B2B, but he has filed the return in the place of B2C.
So this is about outward supply, that in GSTR 1 you have committed this mistake?
Supply.
Outward supply, right?
Yes,
no, so in that case, in case if the system does not allow you to report B2B purchase, I think you should write a letter to the jurisdictional officer and explain this anomaly that that has happened, because that will definitely serve you if tomorrow if the department seeks to issue the notice and try and do the reconciliation of what you submitted vis-a-vis your records. So a letter would be sufficient.
Next, Arvindji, next.
Advocate Raj Tana, please.
Hello, sir. Sir, my question is regarding section 29(5). Sir, whether during cancellation of the registration, whether the registered person has to pay tax on the entire stock or only on the inputs contained in semi-finished and finished goods or held in stock of which he has taken the credit?
So in my opinion, if you read carefully, the amount that has to be paid is only limited to the stock on which he has availed the credit. Now, if you want me to go in detail, I can take some time. If the
No. This is clear, very clear provisions.
Okay.
Yeah.
Otherwise, law is also very clear on this.
Yeah. Next.
Next, Ishan Malhotra.
Sir, I have two queries.
Only one.
Hello.
Fast, please.
Yeah,
Very
please.
fast. We are going out of time.
So the first query is that the ITC is blocked just on the surmises that the ITC claimed was of the bogus billing. So what should be the future aspect of the same? Because the
So in next part we are going to discuss 86A at length. But I would submit that if the transactions are actually genuine, then you should file a writ and get 86A cost.
Okay. And the second query is that, sir, ma'am didn't read it completely. So very fastly, I'll go through that query. So the query is that basically the notification number 5207 exempts the seeking registration where entire tax is payable under RCM. And the IGST notification 10/2017 exempt from seeking registration where aggregate turnover is above 20 lakhs. Sir, my query is that which is the relevant notification under IGST 52 of the exempt registration from entire tax of payable RCM, and where the advocates are providing taxable services in IGST above 20 lakhs. So is it compulsory for them to get the registration done?
No, in my opinion, no. The answer is clear, no.
Even if the going above the threshold limit of 20 lakhs?
Yeah, absolutely.
In IGST?
Absolutely, sir. The notification is very clear. It's somewhere in 17. If you PM me, I will be able to find and give you. Even sir will be able to give you. But right now, it's not handy. But you are exempt, don't worry. Next.
Next, Mr. Vipul Satrani.
Yes, sir. Very good afternoon, Abhijji. It's always a pleasure listening to you, sir. So my question is that, suppose I'm entering into a venture where I'm acquiring a land, and on that I'm doing a construction with the intention to let it out for a longer lease to a corporate. So whether I'll be able to get the ITC on the inputs, both goods and services, and if there is any judgment, can you please give me the judgment also if available?
No, so there is a judgment of Orissa High Court in case of Safari Retreat where they have interpreted the word which is contained in 17.5 clause D, where it says that credit will not be allowed in respect of works contract even if it is for own use. That word own use has been interpreted narrowly, but I have my doubts on that judgment and how Supreme Court is going to look at it. So we have been advising that it would be prudent to avail it and reverse it under protest. There is a concept of protest which even Supreme Court you will find. There is a landmark decision of India Cements of 1989, where in law there was no mechanism of paying under protest, and still the Supreme Court has upheld that mechanism. So prudent behavior would be that if you want to claim it, kindly claim it, reverse it under protest, and wait for the some final
judgment. So in that case, I would be requiring your legal opinion because my client's case, ITC available.
Yeah,
ITC
personally, please, personally see. Next.
We close now.
Yes, I'm saying. Only last question, please. It's almost time.
Last, Advocate Mr. Vipul Shah.
Vipul bhai, are you there? He's not there. Next.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to know if the RCM on GTA is dependent on the transporter, either he's registered or not.
No.
Rate of GST.
No. See, here the transporter has an option. If he is registered, he can charge 12% and issue an invoice. He will collect 12% from you, and you can avail the input tax credit if it is for the purpose of business. If he is not charging 12%, if he is registered, he will issue an invoice. He will only show tax payable as 5%, but tax needs to be paid by you. If it is unregistered, you have to make the self-invoice. You have to make the self-invoice and you have to pay the tax. So the rate
but in both the cases, I have one query. The registered dealer is actually having the giving the invoice stating that it is a RCM is applicable. Then in the case of recipient, what is the rate of GST?
5%.
12 or 5?
5%.
Okay, but then if in financial year 18-19 they have paid at the rate of 12% and taken credit of ITC also.
Sorry. I'm not able to hear you. Can you just...
In financial year 18-19, the client has, the person is registered transporter and stating that the RCM is applicable. The client has paid the RCM at the rate of 12% and taken the ITC also at the rate of 12%. Now, what is need to be done? Both in case of audit, GST audit is applicable.
As I discussed, tax payable, if it is 5%, ITC available will only be 5%. So excess payment you have made, you should apply for refund.
Okay.
Apply for refund.
No counter questions, because there are.
And whether in GST or audit, whether we need to
close everybody.
say anything.
Madam, no counter questions, please. Please.
We are running out of time. Samirji, go ahead.
Now for Abhay, you were excellent, genius, brilliant. What I don't know what to say about that. But everybody, you can imagine from 450 participants how brilliant you were. Thank you so much. I asked Kuntal Parikh, the Secretary of West Zone, to present a humble vote of thanks. Kuntal?
My dear friend, on behalf of AIFTP West Zone, National President Nikita Ma'am, Secretary General Samir Bhai Jani, President of West Zone Bhaskar Bhai Patel, and the participants, we are grateful to you for explaining the provisions of Section 16 in so detail and replying to each and every query promptly. Thank you very much, Abhay Bhai. It is pleasure to hear you every time. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abhay. Thank you, National President.
Thank you.
We close the meeting.